Okay, we're on part 7, I think, of the walkthrough for Krein. We just got teleported into the marshy jungles of Witchcraft Crater from the Desert Temple of Fatimized Rook. By the way, I'm going to be doing this whole quest in at least 2 videos. The previous quests seemed to have kind of a chapter enveloped in them. It was 1 chapter per quest, where a chapter would be something like the way that the story progresses and where you are progresses and stuff like that. But this quest is very long. I don't know if it's, denser than the other quests as far as like content is concerned, but it does take a long time to get from A to B to C. So definitely this has to be at least 2 videos. Anyway, here we are in a kind of a rainforesty tropical area, and the way this gets introduced is by starting out in a very claustrophobic space and then opening up to a dark corner of the canopy. So this is a nice little introduction with a bunch of scenery and multiple levels of height, although I would have preferred there to be a bit more of a middle level where you could perhaps explore further. But this multi-level jungle piece is very cool as it is, and the purpose of it is evidently as an introductory palette setter, and so there's not much to go on to look at in this first level. It's mostly scenery. There are actually 2 ways out of here, and one is a hidden doorway to sort of a secret map, but you'll have to use Whirlwind Sprint to get to the other side, and that leads directly to the river in Dragon Rest. But the more obvious route is the one I took, which is to go through the upper jungle and then down the second waterfall. The most interesting part of the map is actually the lighting, because it's lit in such a way that it looks like there's significant natural light contrast that differentiates the upper part of the jungle, which is bright and sunny, with the lower part, which is dark and uses warm color contrasts and the fading sunlight to give off a particular visual mood. So, going beyond the marshy portion of the jungle, we entered what feels like a drier, yet still tropical biome with mossy mountains that's contrasted by the scorched earth badlands biome at the bottom of the crater, which gives an opportunity for direct contrast in atmosphere, where the tropical portion is described musically, whereas the bottom is described ambiently as far as auditory environment. And there's also a contrast in image space, which is only available in Old Rim, as far as I know. That kind of changes color, bloom, blur, and stuff like that. Now that's all contrasted by the wet jungle further up, where we have a lagoon and the waterfalls where it's much more lush. So it's a place that feels big because it's a little winding, but it's relatively small as far as world spaces go. And it does a pretty decent job with vanilla assets, because I think if you really wanted to go all out with a jungle world space, you'd really have to have completely original assets that adapt to what you're looking for. Because when you think of and look at real jungles, they're really about high density, small scale terrain variation. So you'd have to have a massive land with a ton of vegetation and ground detail, which is pretty much not anything that Creation Engine supports. Now, coming up, I'm also going to craft a couple of weapons, so we can talk about that now. In Krein, all of the side quests give you different kinds of tokens depending on who is giving you the side quest. And these tokens reveal certain rare weapons that you can craft at a smithy. So for example, if you're in possession of a Dwemer token, there's a Dwemer sword that you can craft. There's a bunch of different tokens, I think about a half dozen. Now, the two swords I'm going to make are the Khajiit short sword and another one. The Khajiit short sword is useful because it has a huge stamina boost, and it's relatively quick. And the second one is the Dwemer Peacemaker, and it's interesting because while it does not have any base enchantment, it is a very fast sword. So you can do very fast combos with it, and it has moderate damage, so the DPS really goes up with that combination, because you can keep your stamina up with the Khajiit short sword enchantment, and then that drives combo attacks with the Dwemer short sword, or the Dwemer Peacemaker. Generally, all of the rare weapons you can craft are very powerful and are a game changer as far as the more intense parts of combat. Now, of course, this is assuming that you're playing this on a vanilla setup and don't have like 100 other mods. Of course, if you have an RPG or something ridiculously OP, like a nuke spell that, you know, expends 0 magicka, then it doesn't matter what you do. But I don't really see the point of those. So I hope people just download those kinds of mods when they're bored and never actually use them. I think the most fun you can get out of those kinds of mod, if you want to goof around, is to go to Gary's mod, which, well, at least at some point, like maybe 5 to 10 years ago, Gary's mod had a modding community that was really into making ridiculous weapons, which is what I'm referring to. Honestly, the best weapon mods I've ever seen come from the Unreal community, and I'm probably biased there because I would say I was part of that community when it was on its last legs, like 2010, and I was barely a teenager. Early 2010s, but still I've played through a bunch of mods pretty much everywhere. Well, I guess not everywhere else, but in a lot of games that have big modding communities. Gary's mod is different because people are really focused on making ridiculous weapons, whereas the Unreal Tournament community made mods that, you know, weapons that actually worked and made sense and you could have fun with. Like, I think if you there's like a nuke arsenal in Gary's mod, and it's like you shoot it 2 times and it's funny, and then it gets bored because it's ridiculous. Whereas, you know, practical weapon mods actually have some sort of challenge to them. You have to. Now, back in around the 2000s and even the late 2010s, early 2010s, the SDKs and editor software for games was relatively limiting. So if you look at mods made for Halo 1 or something like that, for example, they're pretty much all goofy and clumsily made because the tools didn't let you go crazy with what you wanted to make. Whereas Unreal is pretty much the original fully moddable game where people were making total conversion mods for it way back when because the development and editor software was so powerful for it. Versus something like Half-Life, where if you wanted to make a multiplayer plugin without metamod, and not a multiplayer mod, but just a plugin, server-side plugin, which is different, you'd have to hook every exported function to your DLL or SO that you made in C++, and if you're using metamod, then fine, you hooked what you needed, but even then you only have the exposed function API from the SDK. So people had to basically hack Half-Life 1 to find the function signatures so that you could make a fully fledged multiplayer weapon mod that was server-side. And in Unreal Tournament you could make a whole game type, and it was just a mutator, but it, you know, everything is built in, so you just copy paste the files, enable the mutator, and done, instead of having to first set up this whole system of server mod management to install stuff. Like in Gold Source Engine, and then there's an equivalent in Counter-Strike Source and Counter-Strike 2. There's AMXX, and then there's like the admin mod, and it's like, well, you have to install this whole suite to make plugins work and stuff like that. But you didn't have to do anything like that in Unreal Tournament. Unreal Tournament 2004, Unreal Tournament 3, and so on. So in UT99, you could make a whole game type, yeah. But it could do so much more as well, including modifying the HUD, adding new monsters, etc. And that was all server-side stuff. Of course, like the when you're connecting to the server, they'd download the resources, but you didn't have to actually have that set up. So you could have and you did have situations where a server owner can pretty much totally customize their server to be its own game in a sense. And Gary's mod has gotten super moddable as well, so I'll give him credit for that. To the point where like there's all kinds of different game types within servers in Gary's mod and stuff like that. But UT99 was a predecessor to all of that. Like you could do all of that in UT99, and it's like 10 years older, give or take, than Gary's mod, the game. But as far as like a simple plugin in Gold Source Engine, you couldn't do anything like that. And it's a similar case with Quake 3 Arena. And even more modern engines relative to Unreal Engine 1 and 2, like the Creation Engine, the extensibility of the Unreal script dwarfs anything you can do with Papyrus without hacking Creation Engine pretty much. Up to Unreal Engine 3, which obviously was another level as far as modding, because that's when UDK came out. But that's what SKSE basically is that it's, in a sense, it's like ripping off the front-facing functionality, the interface of what Creation Engine makes available to the users from its front-facing software, looks at the underlying workings and takes what it needs, and then hooks those functions and exposes that to the player or the modder. In other words, in order to make Creation Engine even slightly more moddable, you basically have to hack it to rip out what you want to use that. Whereas in Unreal Tournament, which was a game that was released like over 10 years ago, relative to when Skyrim came out, you could already do way more than that. And even with the most modded form of Gold Source Engine, which I mentioned Gold Source because it's a contemporary to Unreal Engine 1, which is the Sven Co-op modified Gold Source Engine, you cannot do like half of the things that you still can do with Unreal Tournament. That's a game that hasn't been updated, hasn't had an update in like 15, 18 years or something like that. So that just gives you an idea of how forward-thinking, how ahead of its time the Unreal Engine editor tooling was. Now, as far as the dragon event, what you have to do is just keep the dragon alive by killing a few of the void mages And you can even heal the dragon if you feel you're falling behind. Even distracting a few of the continuously spawning mages does help, and it's really a time battle because after a few minutes, if it's still alive, the dragon casts a spell that eliminates the remainder of the mages, and then you're done. And this is one of the things that's important because it's an optional event, and I start to see this pattern that if it's an optional event, it's a turning point, no turning back, where if the player does not help the dragon, for example, and either ignores him or lets him die, then that has the potential to unlock a particular ending, depending on what the player did before. Whereas if the player does help the dragon, that unlocks a bunch of dialogue and cutscenes further on in the campaign. So now we're going into the Temple of Scripts, which is another dream world kind of setup, and is evidently unrefined. And while it presents itself as described, it doesn't really have its own personality beyond simply being a dream world. It has nothing in particular that stands out except for the background scenery and the interior, which gives it some degree of conceptual grandness, fine. But there's too much individual contribution on the part of a number of environmental characteristics that don't ever come together in harmony, and hence you can tell the level was sort of rushed as far as conceptualization is concerned. The thing that stands out the most is really the story contribution as well, the gameplay, dialogue, cutscenes, and stuff like that, as well as a boss fight that we're going to talk about in a second. And that all is at least a counterbalance to what is essentially a mediocre environmental design.
What you choose to do shall spell your fate.
Is that your new line of attack? To remain silent? Or will you summon another army of bones to no end? Was it not you who declared so proudly that we ought to use our gift? Now you refuse to speak.
Silvergun, were you so confident that I'd remain silent forever, you would not be here. You are here to end me.
I'm giving you the opportunity to relent.
Ha! Your compassion has left you vulnerable. Had you brought the rest of the dough, you may have stood a chance.
Say, why don't you return home? To the sky? Why fly to the ends of Tazokkan?
Seeing the rest of the world has weathered my hope, yet lifted the veil. Have you ever heard mortals tell their stories? Some of them end with finality unraveled, its fate determined. Yet so many affix an added chapter, as though to refute reality. I realize we are no better.
Cease your lamentations. You are Dova. You ought to start acting like it.
Dover, yes. I ought to lie about our flesh. Tell the world we are superior. Whilst we betray our ideals in secret.
I'm sick of your irreverence.
I have seen the Jur conceal their shame, just like you do. Why? Does it make mortality palatable?
You are not.
And you are not deceptive. Perhaps that is why it becomes so clear to me. No. If that were true, you would understand. You would understand that this world must be returned to darkness. Better darkness than corruption.
Siva.
I forbid you to say my name any longer. In fact, I renounce it. As it happens, I learned a new word.
Siva. That's enough.
Buried word.
Enough of this.
Even
Keep your mouth shut. What have you done?
Now, there's a puzzle within the Temple of Scripts where you have to activate 4 pads, and you have to quickly step on all of them within like 5 seconds to get to the teleporter to turn them on. So immediately upon stepping on one of them, you can get a sense that time is involved somehow, and there's pretty much nothing else to do other than trying to check for a pattern, but there's really no indicator that pattern is involved either. So there's only time, and hopefully that gets you to figure out that it means that you have to activate them within the time frame. So I would say it's not too tricky of a puzzle at all. After that, we come to the boss fight, which is Entroper and Fade, except they are not holding back this time as they did in the intro level. So this is definitely a hard tier boss fight, and probably in the top 3 hardest boss fights in the entire campaign. The catch is that if you're a spellcaster, you'll have a different fight than if you're a melee. If you have melee, then they're both melee, and if you're a spellcaster, then Fade will use magic, including her magic arrows. So actually overall, I would say in this case, this fight is a bit more challenging as a spellcaster, which is unusual. Potions and scrolls are really key here if you're not very high level, by the way. Maybe if you're like ridiculously high level, you can just brute force the fight. I'm not sure. But I've played it like this is like a mid-level, actually kind of lowish, lower to mid-level character around like 20 something. With spell casting. It's basically a mage build. So Entroper casts a buff that makes him faster, so he'll chase you down, and also a lightning cloak. Whereas Fade has a really nasty low magicka, high damage explosive magical projectile that's relatively fast, and that can mess you up really quickly if you don't avoid it. In addition, she'll summon a magic arrow that will take a bunch of your magicka away, and does a mid-range explosive AoE. Also, Entroper's sword does massive damage, including magicka damage, so you want to kite him and avoid him as much as possible. So my strategy, I think, was primarily to LOS Fade as much as possible while kiting Entroper. The key mechanic here is that you have to kill them both at around the same time. Like, for example, if you knock Fade down and she bleeds out for, I don't know, more than, I think, maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And if you haven't also knocked down Entroper, then eventually she'll heal to full health, and vice versa. And they also have a HOT, heal over time tick. So you can't just continuously run away and then look for the perfect moment to strike, because they'll be healed by then, so you have to do continuous damage. Again, if you're on vanilla and you're not, you know, level 100 or something like that, then it's going to be a tough battle. With melee, it's slightly easier, I think. I would just say kite both of them, but really avoid Entroper, because Fade just has his scythe, whereas Entroper still has a Dark Paladin sword, and that's a serious threat. The interesting thing here also is that a lot of decisions that the player made early on coalesce here, like whether the player obeyed Zurikhan in the beginning or not, and whether they won the intro battle in the first dream they had before going to Silvermorn, and a bunch of other things. So this boss fight is actually avoidable and optional if the player did certain things. So this is like another example. I know a lot of mods and games claim to have like non-linear story, and it's like basically linear. It's like, oh, well, the dialogue is slightly different. Like in some of Skyrim's quests are like that. It's like it's the illusion of options, and then it gives you slightly different dialogue, but the ending is the same. But in this case, there's actually, the player's choices actually matter as far as like changing what happens later on.
Let me see that. As expected, magically tethered to its counterpart. We can use this as a compass to lead us to the other. I am not sure where we are headed. The other book is too far to know with certainty. Meet me at the temple, at the bottom of the crater. What is it?
Hey there. Look who finally showed up.
Idiot! You broke the transporter. That is why we were delayed.
But last time, you told me to press... You know what? Never mind. Let's just focus on the present, shall we?
I am sure the keys are long lost by now. High time we witness your talents, lizard.
Wait, we're here for the dragon book, right?
Do not worry, we have it here.
Halfway done. Good to hear. Where are we headed?
As I said before, I am not sure where we are headed. Though, if I had to guess, there is a Dwemer temple not too far from here.
Oh, another one then. Well, this time you ought to push the buttons.
So, you admit you are colorblind.
I never said that. What's the matter?